In this tutorial, I will show you how to convert a photo of a daytime scene like this into a dramatic night scene looking like this. We'll use some simple blending techniques and a few textures that you can download from texturesforphotoshop.com. You can find the links to these textures in the description of this video. So let's get started. So we're starting with this image, which is obviously a daytime image, and we want to convert this into a night scene. The first step that we will do is to add a gradient map. To do this, you go to the adjustment layers and choose the gradient map. I already did this here, so I added this gradient map. This gives a night look to the scene, and the gradient is simply a gradient going from black to dark blue. Also, what I did here is I set the blending mode for this layer to multiply. Next, we will use the moon texture, and we want to add this into the scene. So to do this, I created a group, and inside the group I have the moon texture, and you can see it here. I switched the blending mode to screen and lowered the opacity to 75%. And as you can see, the moon is added and it's blended, but it's not quite correctly blended because we can see through it. So what I did is I added an extra layer here for the background. And to do this, I simply clicked Ctrl-Shift-N to add a new layer. So I added a new layer underneath. I chose a brush with a hard edge, using the opacity 100 and the flow 100, and also choosing a dark blue color from the background. I increased the size of the brush, and you can do this using the brackets keys. So I simply clicked once, and then I got this result. Because this layer is behind the moon, you can see it fill up the space, so we're not seeing through the moon anymore. And I simply changed the blending mode to darken. And one extra thing I did is go to the filter and use Gaussian blur to get a softer effect. It doesn't have to be too much, around 7 pixels would do. And if I click this to make it visible again, this is the result I got. One extra thing I did is I added this glow to the moon, because the moon glows. So the way I did this is I also added a new layer by clicking Ctrl-Shift and then enter, and using this time the brush but with a softer edge and a smaller brush, choosing a white color and quickly painting something rough over the moon. Obviously this is too much, so what I did is first I changed the blending mode to screen, then I went to blur, also used Gaussian blur, this time a little more, too much. Yeah, something like that is okay. If it's too much, then you can use the eraser tool and just quickly erase around it. And this looks okay. So I'll delete this and revert to what I had initially. The next thing I did is I wanted to add some stars. So for this, I used this texture that you can download from texturesforphotoshop.com. You find the description in the description. You find the link to this in the description below. So I simply added this texture to the document, and I also used a mask for this because I don't want the stars to appear on land and in the water. And the way I created this mask is I simply added the mask. Let me go in the original layer, and using the quick selection tool I quickly selected land and the sea, and also I want the lighthouse. It's okay if you go over, you can simply hold down the Alt key and do this. Then back in the layer, let me delete this layer mask and then click the mask icon again, and now I have a mask that obviously is reverted. So I now clicking on the mask, I can Control and I to invert the mask, and there you have it, the sky with the stars. Another thing I did is switch the blending mode to screen and also lower the opacity to around 30% or 35%. That's good. Okay, let me revert to the original layer. Okay, and another thing that I did was because the stars are a bit too faint, I wanted them to be a bit more bright, so I added a levels adjustment layer. To do this, you simply go to adding an adjustment layer and choosing levels, and this levels adjustment layer, I simply pull down the white point a bit, so you can see what this does. It increases the brightness of the layer. Also, I clicked on this to clip the results to the layer below. The next thing I did was to add this meteor shower texture, because I wanted some falling stars in the screen. So for this, I simply added the layer. I grouped the layer with itself by clicking Ctrl G, so I created this group, and I used the same mask as before to only show in the sky. If I delete this layer mask and I want to set it again, I can simply Control and click on a mask that I already have, and then clicking on the group, I can click again on the mask and I get the mask. And this is how I can reuse the masks. Now back to the falling stars, because the original texture has a bit of a glow and this is too much for this, I added levels adjustment layer, and this simply reduces the glow of the falling stars. And to do this, I move the midpoint to the right, and you can see this is how it looked before, and this is what I get now. Okay, next I used this silk texture because I wanted to add some highlights in the water. We have the water below here, and now you see the waves, but I wanted a bit more highlights in the waves. So to do this, I added this texture. I switched the blending mode to color dodge and lowered the opacity to about 50%. Also, I used a mask for this, so I don't want it to show all over. So I will show you how I do this. So I'll delete the layer mask. This was obviously too much, so I used mask, and then I clicked on the mask, clicked Ctrl I to invert the mask to hide everything, and then choosing a soft brush and the color white, I simply did something like this, painting over the water. And of course this is obviously too much, so I can go to filter and Gaussian blur and choose a big value for this, and I get something like this. Okay, let me revert to the original result that I got. I also thought that this is a bit too bright, so I added a new levels adjustment layer. So here are the values for this. I simply moved a bit the midpoint to the right, and this decreases the intensity of the highlights. Let's move on. I added this exposure adjustment layer. To do this, you simply go to the adjustment layer and choose exposure, because I wanted to darken a bit the scene. It's a night scene, so I want it to be a bit more dark. But I also added a layer mask to this, so I simply painted using the black a black brush. I painted over the areas that I wanted to be a bit brighter, because if you look here in the exposure, the exposure, you can see that I lowered the exposure to about -178. So I wanted to lower the exposure for the entire scene, except for some parts that I wanted to be a bit brighter, like in the area of the lighthouse, and you'll see in a minute why. I also wanted to add some highlights, and to do this I used a very simple technique. So I clicked Ctrl+Shift+N and added a new layer. Then I used Shift and F5. This brings up the fill dialog box, and I want this to fill with 50% gray. Okay, this fills up the screen with 50% gray, and if I choose overlay, then it disappears. But what is useful here is that I can choose the dodge tool, and using a relatively small brush, let's say, I can use this dodge tool to go over this gray layer, and what this will do is it will brighten the scene wherever I click it, because we're in overlay mode, so wherever I click it gives me more brightness. It's a very subtle effect, but it goes a long way. So here's without the overlay and here's with the overlay. Okay, let me revert to what I had before. So these are a few highlights. Next, I wanted to add the lighthouse, because the lighthouse will have a light on the top, so I want this to be a bit brighter. And what I did is I simply duplicated the original layer and I set a mask to it to only view the lighthouse itself. And also this gives me the lighthouse as it looks during the daytime. But I wanted to go a step further, so what I did is I applied a hue and saturation adjustment layer. To do this, you go to the adjustment layer, choose hue and saturation, and the saturation, I increased the saturation and also increased a bit the lightness, so I just get a bit more dramatic look to the lighthouse. Here's without the saturation and here it is with the saturation. I also added a mask to this group of layers which contains the saturation and the lighthouse itself, because if you see here, I want the saturation to only come through only in some parts of the lighthouse and not on the entire lighthouse, because otherwise it's too flat. So what I did, let me delete this layer mask and add a new layer mask. I'm hitting Ctrl+I to revert how it looks, and then using a soft brush, a brush with the soft edges, and using the color white, I can simply go like this and just paint the areas that I want to come through. Okay, let me revert to what I had before. Yep, this is it. Okay, Next we will add the light beams coming from the Lighthouse, and to do this we will use this texture that you can also download from textures for photoshop.com. And to do this I simply switch the blending mode to screen and use Ctrl and T to change the size of the beam and rotate it and place it somewhere here. Maybe make it a bit smaller, and like this. I can also use the keyboard for adjusting the position, and I can use the blur and motion blur to give it a bit of a fade effect. I can change the angle to match the angle of the light beam, and that should be good. So this is what I did, and I ended up with this. I also added a hue saturation adjustment layer. To do this you go to the adjustment layers and choose hue and saturation, and I did this only for lowering the opacity to around -36. Another thing that I did is I wanted to add a glow to this light, and to do this it's very simple. I simply click Ctrl Shift N, create a new layer, then using the polygonal lasso tool I simply draw a triangle matching with the light ray, and double click to close. Let me do this again. Yep. Okay, so I got this selection, and with this selection on I can use the bucket fill tool and choose white as the color and fill this up. Then clicking Ctrl D to deselect, using filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and a little less Gaussian blur, something like that should do, and then going to the screen blending mode and decreasing the opacity, and you get something like this. I did the same and I ended up with something like this. And yeah, you can use the screen mode, which is obviously too harsh, but you can also use the soft light, and this gives a softer effect. This is one of the light beams, and I did two of them. I used exactly the same technique, so I will not go through this again. This is the result that I got. These two are exactly the same. I can also duplicate the beam to get the same effect. And what I did is I selected these two light beams, right click, duplicate layers, OK, right click again on them, merge layers, and then I get this. This looks ugly, but if I change the blending mode to screen, I get a softer look. And now if I click Ctrl T and resize them, then place them in the center, rotate them a bit. Let me see if I can put them in the center. And then choose the eraser, apply transformation, choose the eraser and just go over it, and with a soft brush I just erase the tips. Then I get something like this. Cool. So what's next? Next, I just wanted to give a bit more dramatic look to this, so I used this texture in the middle of the lighthouse to add a bit of a flare and light burst. And to do this, I switched the blending mode to screen, and move this in the center of the lighthouse. Click Ctrl T, make it smaller, and even smaller, and then quickly go to filter. I have to apply the transformation, and then go to the filter, blur, and a Gaussian blur would do. This is too much. Something like this would work. You can also do this using a smart object. So if you transform the texture into a smart object, then you can apply filters to it, and this is what I did here. The cool thing about smart objects and the smart filters is that you can go back, for example, to the Gaussian blur, and you can see I can change the settings if I want to later. Okay, so now for some finishing touches. What I did here is, because I wanted to have much more glow here in the center of the lighthouse, I added this gradient fill light. To do this, you simply go to the adjustment layers and add a gradient adjustment layer, and for this gradient fill I used these settings. So I used a gradient that goes from white through orange all the way to yellow, and also if you see here I played around with the way the opacity ends, because this is starting from opacity 100 to 0 opacity, so I wanted to crunch down the gradient such that I only get glow here in the middle. Next I added a new layer, also using the same technique as before, so Control Shift N and then Shift F5 using a 50% gray fill, switching to overlay and then using the dodge tool. And the reason I did this was because I wanted some extra highlights, so I painted the highlights where I want them, and here's how it looks like in the normal mode, and here's how it looks in the overlay mode, so without the highlights and with the highlights. And this just gives a bit more the impression that the light is coming from the lighthouse. And the final layer is a gradient map, and this is just a cool technique to make all the colors in the scene look more consistent. So to add a gradient map, you simply go to adjustment layers and choose gradient map, and this is what this does. So I choose this gradient map that uses a couple of colors, actually more than a couple. So I go from a black color to a dark blue color to orange through yellow and then to white. So there you have it. This is the end result. And let's see what we started with. We had a bunch of textures, and then using some blending techniques and these textures, we went from this to this. I hope you enjoy this tutorial, and I hope to see you again here. Remember to subscribe to this channel if you like this tutorial. If you have any questions, just drop me a comment and I'll try to answer it as soon as possible.